Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of the hour. President Donald Trump delivers a speech from the White House highlighting his achievements and setting out parts of his agenda for the year ahead. He blames former President Joe Biden for immigration and inflation problems as polls show public frustration with the economy. European Union leaders gather in Brussels to try to agree on a major loan to fund Ukraine's military and financial needs for the next 2 years. The talks focus on how to cover most of the 137 billion euros the IMF says Ukraine needs. Ukrainian drones strike a tanker docked at the Russian port of Rostov-on-Don, killing and injuring several people, according to the city's mayor. Russian officials say the attack sparks a fire on the vessel, with emergency teams moving in to extinguish the blaze. Taiwan says the United States is moving ahead with an $11.1 billion arms package, the largest ever for the island. The deal, the second under President Donald Trump's current administration, comes as China steps up military pressure on Taiwan. Israeli troops fire a mortar over the ceasefire line into a Palestinian residential area in Gaza, wounding at least 10 people according to local health officials. The Israeli military says the round veers off course during an operation near the so-called Yellow Line and says the incident is under investigation. Meanwhile, the United Nations and aid groups warn humanitarian operations in Gaza risk collapse over what they call a vague and politicized Israeli registration process. They say dozens of groups face deregistration by the end of the year and closure within 60 days, while Israel says it is meeting aid obligations under President Donald Trump's plan. Brazil's Senate approves a bill that would reduce the prison sentence of former President Jair Bolsonaro over an alleged coup plot. After lower house approval, the measure now goes to President Luiz Inácio da Silva, who will veto it. The gunman who kills 2 Brown University students remains at large 4 days after opening fire inside a classroom in Rhode Island. Authorities say there is still no identification of the suspect, leaving the community on edge. We start this hour in the United States once again, and 4 days after a gunman opened fire inside a classroom at Brown University, killing 2 students, the suspect still remains unidentified and at large. The shooting, which also left at least 8 others wounded, occurred inside a classroom in Providence. Authorities have not yet captured the perpetrator, and the lack of identification has left the community on edge. Police have released security camera footage of a masked man they believe to be the shooter, based on witness accounts, but still have no leads on his identity or motive. Providence Police Chief Oscar Perez described the investigation as probably the most intense in the nation, while Mayor Brett Smiley echoed residents' frustrations, sharing their restless and eager desire for an arrest. Now, in a new development, police have released grainy images of another unidentified man who was seen near the crime scene and may have information relevant to the investigation. Local authorities continue to urge residents to check their security cameras for any sightings of the shooter, as the search for the gunman continues to intensify. We're now joined by Irina Shukerman. She is a senior journalist and she joins us live from New York in the United States. Irina, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for taking the time. Now, we're 4 days on from this shooting, which killed 2 people. No suspect, no motive, no identity. How unusual is it for a mass shooting in a heavily surveilled city like Providence. And what does this say about the limits of the modern US police system?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for addressing this important topic. Indeed, many of the mass shootings were actually quite public. The motive there seemed to be at least as much attention-seeking as it was political messaging. And the individuals who were involved in those incidents were frequently people who were disturbed, disaffected, angry, but still looking for publicity. This incident, that's not to say that they didn't necessarily have some level of planning or capability, but in this situation there seems to be a different motive. Whoever is behind it seemed intent on escaping and not being arrested or killed, and that's what makes this situation quite different. The perpetrator or perpetrators took measures to conceal their identity. The image that was captured on a video camera appeared to be of an individual wearing a mask, and the image was quite grainy. It was difficult to see, and even if that person wasn't wearing a mask, I think distinguishing the features would not have been very easy. It's clear that the shooter was well prepared and may have been aware of the location of the cameras and deliberately evaded them, or only appearing briefly and with a face that was covered and difficult to recognize. In addition, what's interesting is that there were at least one individual who came under suspicion early on and who seemed to fit a profile of somebody who might have been involved in such an incident. We remember that just 6 months ago, there was another attack, this time against 2 Israeli diplomats, where an individual with a similar political profile, radicalized, pro-Palestinian, was involved in the attack, and that person gave himself up peacefully and didn't seek to escape. He wanted to bring attention to a clearly politically motivated act, and that's it. It is possible that the perpetrator had accessories who helped him escape and who diverted attention and who were also potentially assisting with logistics or intelligence even at the scene. And the suspect who was released quickly may have been somebody from the shooter's ecosystem. It's entirely possible, of course, that it could have been someone much more professional, who was aware of who was around at that particular time and found the right moment to use others as a diversion and to conceal his or her own identity. But regarding the police work, it's not clear whether or not they're doing a good job, because there simply is not enough information on what kind of intelligence could have been gathered at the scene and what courses, what leads, if any, they are pursuing. It is normal not to reveal information at the early stages of investigation. What's much more surprising is that the FBI director, Kash Patel, took credit for the early arrest after a similarly premature episode in a past occurrence, and essentially put the individual who does not appear to have current links to the shooting in the spotlight, potentially creating all sorts of complications in his life. It may turn out that this guy was somehow involved, but it may also turn out that he was completely unrelated, and the zeal of the FBI director to take credit for an early jump on the investigation may have, first of all, assisted the shooter, and second, provided an opening for liability.
Irina, The police have said that this is the most intense investigation in the nation. When authorities use language like that, is that reassurance, do you think, or is that a sign that they've possibly hit a wall here?
Well, I think they're trying to. I think they're trying to send a message that they are putting all their efforts and that they're clearly concerned about getting the results quickly. I think they reassure. The problem is that simultaneously to that incident, there was another mysterious attack in Brookline of an MIT professor who was shot 3 times in his own house and found dead, and there seems to be no leads or information about the motive or who might be behind this, and the speculation is being fueled about potential foreign Iranian ties to that killing. And if the police is sending a message that this is the incident that everyone is focusing in, then the message, the family of that professor and anyone concerned about that story is that if all efforts are on the Brown University mass attack, then that means that perhaps not enough resources are being devoted to the other investigation that could also have national dimensions to it as well.
Yes, Irina, do stay with us as we have further news coming out of the United States coming up next for our viewers. Now, Nick Reiner, the younger son of late Hollywood filmmaker and political activist Rob Reiner, has made his first court appearance for the 2 murder charges he faces in the stabbing deaths of his parents. The arraignment was delayed until January the 7th, and Nick did not enter a plea. He is accused of fatally stabbing his parents to death, including actor-director Rob Reiner and photographer-producer Michelle Reiner, in the early morning hours of December the 14th in the affluent West LA neighborhood of Brentwood. He then fled the scene. The couple's bodies were discovered on Sunday afternoon. Nick, who has publicly acknowledged a years-long struggle with drug addiction, was arrested that night in a downtown Los Angeles park near the University of Southern California campus. Authorities say he was taken into custody without incident and was booked on suspicion of murder into a downtown jail where he remains held with bond. Irina, what more can you tell us about this case? Of course, it combines extreme violence here with a high-profile name. You also have a previous presidential engagement as well, which sparked many reactions. How are people in the United States feeling about this case?
Well, I think there are many fans of Rob Reiner who are deeply saddened by this tragic occurrence, and of course there are many close friends, associates, and his daughter for whom the whole situation is absolutely devastating. Parents killed, brother accused of murder, the US president sending very uncharitable remarks in that direction. Even some of the Trump own supporters have criticized the rhetoric. But I think the interesting point that no one has really made, as far as I have seen, is that the president's comments may have prejudiced the investigation. I don't think it's going to be a substantial impact, but it could have under other circumstances where there was less evidence perhaps pointing in the direction of the perpetrator. Comments about the potential motive by someone so senior could have an impact on investigation and on the defense of the defendant. The fact that Trump was ascribing TDS or some sort of political motivation to the killing is a significant diversion from the likely reality of a mentally compromised, drug-addled individual with a long history of disturbing action and problems with drugs. Again, I don't think it will really affect the investigation, because in this case the case seems to be reasonably straightforward, but under other circumstances it could have impact, and it may be used as a potential defense strategy.
Yes.
That his case is not being handled fairly.
Yes, Irina Sukerman, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much for taking the time. We now move on to West Asia for our next story, and Israeli troops fired a mortar into a Palestinian residential area in Gaza, wounding at least 10 people, officials have said. The strike occurred near the so-called Yellow Line, which marks the ceasefire boundary, and the military says the mortar veered off its intended target. This incident adds tension to the fragile Israel-Hamas truce, which has already seen over 370 Palestinian deaths since October the 10th, which is when the ceasefire deal was signed. Both sides accuse each other of violations, delaying the next phase of the ceasefire deal, which includes disarmament, troop withdrawals, and an international stabilization force. Humanitarian groups warn that Gaza's 2 million residents continue to face severe shortages of food and aid, with most displaced and living in damaged buildings or tent camps. The conflict has left more than 70,000 Palestinians dead, roughly half of them women and children, while almost all hostages taken in October have been returned or accounted for. Now we're joined by Peter Bohr. He is the editor of the Weekly Blitz, and he joins us live from London. Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Peter, Israel says the mortar veered off target. Given the density of Gaza and its track record of precision claims, why should the international community accept that explanation at face value?
Good day, Thomas. Nice to be with you again. Probably the international community may not accept Israel's explanation at face value. That's the probability of it. I've been following this story. It first broke about 15 hours ago, and it seems as if this particular rocket was one of about 7 fired, Israel claimed, precision strikes at Hamas operatives in the area, and this particular rocket that supposedly has wounded up to 10 civilians has veered off course. Now, I understand from just before I got on here, I was in touch with someone close to the military in Israel, and the Southern Command is currently undergoing an investigation as to what exactly happened. To answer your question, however, when you ask why should the international community accept Israel's explanation, it's possible that those elements within the media, within the political elite who are anti the Netanyahu government, won't accept the explanation, even though it may prove to be true that this was an errant rocket, as the Israelis describe it, which does happen from time to time. We've seen that on both sides of the conflict. So let's see what the investigation proves. If it is had proved to be a mistake rather than a deliberate attack on civilians, Israel would prove that. If it's anything other than that, then I'm sure the world's media will be on Israel's back, claiming another Israeli war atrocity. But for the moment, it does seem that it looks like this was an unforgivable yet understandable mistake. Knowing the Israelis, they will do fair diligence. I guess, Thomas, the story will be lost within the next 48 to 72 hours anyway. So let's see what happens and what the Israelis come up with.
Why would the Israelis be striking near this ceasefire boundary anyway? And how would you analyse Israeli action post the ceasefire deal now? We've, of course, had multiple claims of multiple violations from both sides, but what we do know is over 370 Palestinians have been killed since that October the 10th ceasefire.
Yeah, that's the most relevant issue here. Now, the willing actors in this, the good faith actors, are still continuing to press the narrative that the ceasefire is holding. Given what's happened in the last 2 years, we're in a much better position than we were during the height of the conflict. But let's be honest, the ceasefire has been broken on multiple times by both sides. This state of affairs will continue to grow, will actually continue until Hamas has been diluted to such an effect that they can no longer pose a military threat to Israel, which day by day is getting weaker and weaker. That the Israelis understand, that the Trump administration understands, and that's why I guess, Thomas, that the Trump administration is so confident that phase 2 of his agreement, i.e. putting foreign peacekeeping troops on the ground, could happen in the early part of 2026. But let's be honest, although it's called a ceasefire, it has been broken on numerous times, but not to the extent that it's going to create the conditions where phase 2 cannot be implemented. Both sides are confident that it will be implemented, and it seems as if Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt, who are the three main players in this, apart from the Trump administration, seem confident enough to accept that whilst the ceasefire is broken, phase 2 of the plan can be implemented, as I say, in the early part of 2026.
Yes, Peter, do stay with us as we have a related development coming up next. In the United Nations and aid groups have warned that humanitarian operations in Gaza are at risk of collapse. They say Israel's complex registration process is blocking aid, leaving millions of dollars of food, medical supplies and shelter materials stuck outside the territory. Dozens of international aid organisations face deregistration by the end of the year, which would force them to close within 60 days. The groups provide essential services, including field hospitals, emergency shelters, water and sanitation and nutrition programs for children. Aid agencies stress that humanitarian access must not be politicised, and immediate action is needed to prevent a catastrophic impact on Gaza's population. Israel has not responded to requests for comment, and aid remains far below what is required despite the fragile ceasefire. Peter, why is Israel not letting in this aid? Of course, this is going to be, there's been huge international condemnation, mainly during the war, while hostility was in full flow. But what is your feeling? Now you hear that Israel is still making it logistically near impossible for some of these aid agencies to get that food in, to get it to the people that most need it inside the Gaza Strip?
Well, this really depends, Thomas, on what your view and analysis is of those aid agencies who for years have been demonising Israel. Now, this is a very important story for the UN going forward, because the aid agencies such as UNRWA, who have been facilitating the Gaza conflict for decades, are losing credibility as each month goes by. And what we have here, Thomas, is two opposing sides: the aid agencies and their business model that has enriched terrorists. And
Peter, it is not just the UN, however. It is more than 200 other local and international aid groups in a joint statement that have released this information. UNRWA, of course, is a point of dispute. Both sides agree. Israel, of course, accuses UNRWA of being completely biased towards Israel. However, it's not just them that's saying this. It's the United Nations and 200 other local and international aid groups. Why isn't Israel letting aid into the Gaza Strip even still?
Look, I think, Thomas, you've answered your own question. Just think about what you've said. 200 aid agencies in an area no bigger than New Jersey. It is absolutely absurd. It is ridiculous that there are 200 aid agencies operating in the area. Now, why are those aid agencies operating? Not to help the Palestinians. They're operating because there's a business model here, Thomas, that needs to be broken. That's the point.
Peter, 80% of the Gaza Strip is destroyed. Like nearly, well, reportedly, 70,000 people are dead. Obviously, there's been a famine declared there. 200 aid agencies, of course, is a huge number, but of course the international community has rallied behind the humanitarian cause of Gaza.
Thomas, there's a famine in Sudan. Do you think there are 200 aid agencies operating in Sudan? Let's be realistic and let's be honest about this. Those aid agencies are banding together because there is a business model here that they want to keep going, and Israel and the United States are determined to break that business model. We've seen UNRWA operatives, UNRWA staff actually being Hamas operatives. The whole idea of the aid agencies are honest players in this conflict is absolutely absurd. They have encouraged and facilitated the Gaza conflict for decades, and it is in their financial interests to keep this conflict going. So the mere fact that, as you quite rightly stated, that there are 200 aid agencies backing this is an absolute absurdity. I wish there were 20 aid agencies in Sudan where there is a famine going on. I think that's the question that your viewers and listeners would be most interested in. So why is Israel standing steadfast against these aid agencies? Because the aid agencies themselves have lost total credibility when it comes to this conflict.
Peter,
you mentioned
Peter, of course, the first phase of the ceasefire cites the unrestricted flow of humanitarian aid. These aid agencies are saying that Israel isn't adhering to that.
Yes, they can say what they like, Thomas. It doesn't mean that what they're saying is truthful. In fact, it's absolute rubbish. When we saw that the aid agencies were saying that I think it was the United Nations representative, Tom Fletcher, who got up on the UN and said that 14,000 babies will die of starvation and malnutrition. It's absolute hogwash.
He did correct himself on that. To be fair to Tom Fletcher, he did correct himself after saying that.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Well, I wonder whether these other aid agencies, who have stated that the aid isn't getting through, will correct themselves as well.
Okay, Peter, do stay with us as we have further news updates coming out of the region. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel has approved a natural gas agreement with Egypt. Netanyahu has described it as the country's largest ever gas deal that will position Israel as a regional energy power, strengthening its status. Netanyahu has agreed that the deal was made with American company Chevron, which will supply gas to Egypt. He added that the deal, which had been held up over some outstanding issues, would help secure stability in the region. Let's in fact listen in to what the Israeli Prime Minister has said on the issue.
היום אישרתי את עסקת הגז הגדולה בתולדות ישראל. היקף העסקה עומד על 112 מיליארד שקלים. מתוך זה, 58 מיליארד שקלים ייכנסו לקופת המדינה.
Ease an energy crisis in Egypt, which has spent billions of dollars on importing liquefied natural gas since its own supplies fell short of demand. Egypt's production began declining in 2022, forcing it to abandon its ambitions to become a regional supply hub. It has increasingly turned to Israel to make up the shortfall. Peter Baum joins us once again. Peter, Netanyahu calls this the largest ever gas deal and path to regional stability. But is this about stability, or is it about locking in geopolitical leverage through energy?
Both, I think, Thomas. It's a huge deal for both Israel and Egypt, and it should provide energy needs for both parties for the decades ahead. It's incredible that Egypt, given the story that we've previously been speaking about, the aid agencies, it's incredible that Egypt has come under no criticism for undertaking this deal with Israel, which has been in the, forgive the pun, which has been in the pipeline for the last 2 or 3 years. It's apparently valued at $35 billion, which is by any standards an absolutely huge deal. Now, if it comes to fruition, and Israeli technology is certainly good enough to ensure that it does succeed, I think it really does have the ability to ensuring regional stability. Of that, there's no doubt. If people have electrical needs and all the requirements that are given for their energy needs, that really provides economic growth for both countries and should help stabilise the area. Now, of course, there will be those that will be wishing to destroy that, but I think on the basis, if we're really talking about what's good for the region, what the region needs, this will underpin peace and stability, or should underpin peace and stability in the decades ahead.
Peter Baum, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, sir.
World. It's always a pleasure. Now,
thank you, Thomas.
US President Donald Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth have attended a ceremony to honor US personnel killed in Syria over a suspected Islamic State attack. According to the United States military, 2 US Army soldiers and a civilian interpreter were killed in the central Syrian town of Palmyra by an attacker who targeted a convoy of American and Syrian forces before being shot dead. However, Trump has called the incident terrible and has vowed for retaliation and referred to 3 US soldiers that were slain as great patriots. Well, that's all that we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more international updates.